Hello, hello, hello. I realize I have one of my blue shirts on tonight. I do have other colors. Actually, I think this is technically a purple shirt, but that's another matter. I hope you're doing well this evening. I am certainly doing very well. I've been having a good time today, though a little confused by the deluge of all the bull that I've been seeing. Anyway, very nice to see you. Let me check in and see exactly who's here. So, Greg, hi, nice to see you. Lana and Cheyenne, nice to see you too. And Teresa Sanders, hey, Teresa. Where's Kayla? I seem to be missing Kayla. I don't see Kayla. And Cheyenne says, how about a code pink shirt, Joe? Now, that's a very good idea, Cheyenne, but I have my code pink shirt in the closet. I'll probably wear that one Saturday night. Anyway, please share, everybody. Uh, I'll slow things down for a minute or two to allow a few more people to get a chance to arrive, but I won't wait too long. In fact, it's already 9:09, so I think maybe I am not going to wait at all. The first thing I want to do is go over a really terrific article on the IMF, which appeared in Truthdig. So let me make sure I've got that article dialed in here. And then let me shift to the view that gives you me in the upper corner and the article very visible to you. And this is an article that, as I said, appeared in Truthdig on October 15th. It's called "The IMF is Utterly Indifferent to the Pain It's Causing." And there's a picture of Christine Lagarde, the outgoing head of the IMF, who's moving over to the European Central Bank. Gee, now she can tyrannize over the European Central Bank. Okay, this is an article written by Vijay Prashad under the banner of the Independent Media Institute that has a lot of great writers in its stable, including Tom Hartman for one, but also many, many other great writers. I think that also R.J. Eskow is writing for them too right now, as I recall, if I recall correctly. Anyway, let's get even a better, cleaner view of the article. And so VJ points to the gathering of the board in Washington, D.C., the headquarters of the IMF, are here, and the United States government has a great deal of control over the IMF, okay, and what it does. And it was through the IMF and through the influence of the U.S. government that the program of the Peterson International Institute, okay, of Economics, what later became the Peterson International Institute, was at the time the International Institute, of Economics, that the neoliberal program of the IIE was interjected into the IMF, and through the IMF was imposed on a great deal of the world that either had or was seeking funding by the IMF. This was mostly true, of the developing world, but it also had an increasing amount, of influence over Europe, especially when the Eurozone became the dominant factor, in Europe after 1995. Anyway, this year the IMF will meet under the leadership of a new chief, Kristalina Georgieva, who crossed the street from the World Bank, which also has its headquarters here, in D.C. It's right downtown, roughly, I guess, about 50 minutes away from me if I take the fast ways to get there, which are a little more expensive, who crossed the street from the World Bank to take over this post from Christine Lagarde. But Christine Lagarde, as it happens, is getting ready to cross the Atlantic Ocean to take over the European Central Bank. There is a game of there's a game, of musical chairs at the top. A handful of bureaucrats seem to waltz in and out of these jobs. These are bureaucrats, also technocrats, who know very little beyond the technical games they learned over the years, and who make absolutely technocratic decisions, as we'll see, with little concern for the consequences. For the past 40 years, the IMF has had the same agenda to make sure that developing countries adhere to the rules, of globalization set by the advanced capitalist states, and intensified as the capitalist states began to adopt the neoliberal form, of ideology, and the formulas that were advanced by the neoliberals as good management, good financial management for the developmental process. Let's go on with the article. Sovereignty of these developing countries has become irrelevant as their governments have to accede to pressure from the IMF on fiscal and monetary policy, as well as their trade and uh, development agenda. Any attempt to break the orthodoxy of the IMF is met with a ferocious array of sanctions, including a nod from the IMF towards international creditors not to lend to the country that they determine is a scofflaw. Funds will only flow to distressed companies if they accept the full policy slate developed for them, not by their lawmakers, but by the IMF economists in Washington, D.C. Over these 4 decades, fires have burned on the streets of the countries that have gone to the IMF, should have added, gotten loans from the IMF, and then forced austerity upon their populations according to the conditions laid down by the IMF. In the 1980s, these uprisings used to be called, quote, IMF riots, unquote. It was clear to everyone that the IMF's policies had provoked desperate people to take to the streets. The name given to these riots was precise. The emphasis had to be on the IMF and not on the riots themselves. The most famous of the riots took place in Venezuela, the Caracazo of 1989. Caracazo after Caracas, which opened up a process that brought Hugo Chavez to power and that created the Bolivarian the Bolivarian Revolution. It is reasonable to call the Arab Spring of 2011 an IMF riot because it was provoked by IMF austerity policies combined with rising food prices. The current unrest from Pakistan to Ecuador should also be filed under IMF riot. In response to these riots, the IMF has used new language to describe the old policies. We hear of, quote, social compacts, unquote, and of structural adjustment 2.0, and then the bizarre, quote, expansionary austerity, unquote. Discussions of gender and environmentalism within the IMF are all to the good. But these are merely words that adorn an entrenched regime of austerity that defines the IMF Article 4 consultations and the IMF staff papers. I think I want to say here that the IMF staff papers do not necessarily adorn a regime of austerity. A number of the IMF staff papers, written in recent years, have disagreed with the regime of austerity, and increasingly the economists of the IMF have been less than enthusiastic about the regime of austerity. But this did not much impress the operational portions of the IMF, and particularly Lagarde herself went right ahead with the old formulas and applying the old formulas to new loans that were negotiated and let out by the IMF. So that even though the old regime of austerity had been discredited in much, okay, of academia, and even among the World Bank staff and the IMF staffs themselves, uh, those still were the formulas that were getting applied by the operational staff of the IBM. Okay, as Vijay Prashad says, beneath the smiles lies the skull, a terrible reliance on policies that are framed by wage cuts and the shrinking of the public sector, by handcuffs on public spending and uh, by liberalization of spending for corporations. Sweeter rhetoric does nothing to make the policy framework less harsh. Ecuador's people rose up against President Moreno's deal with the IMF. He had to go back on the cuts on fuel subsidies. However, Moreno had no choice. The protests would simply have unseated him if he held to the line. But now Moreno must return to the IMF. If democratic norms actually prevailed, then the IMF would have to honor the quote, the referendum, unquote, of the Ecuadorian people. But there is no democracy in the IMF. Of course not. It's a neoliberal organization. There's no respect for democracy in the IMF because it's governed by neoliberalism. That's really the point of this whole thing going on with the article. It marches to the drum of its main funder. But its main funder is a democracy, right? Its main funder is the United States. Why is it that a democracy like the United States imposes the opposite of democracy when it is the main founding power behind the IMF and the United States owns 16.52% of the voting shares? Why is the IMF then denying democracy and crushing it across the world? Might it have to do with the reality that the United States is perhaps no longer the democracy it may have been in times gone by? I wonder. Currently, the United States, with 16.52% of the voting shares, has the largest block of votes on the board. Following behind are Japan, 6.15%. Another democracy, right? China, 6.09%. Well, the Chinese, they're not a democracy, right? Germany, 5.32%. A proud neoliberal democracy, okay, of Europe. that just got through contributing mightily to the crushing of Greece and the hopes of the people, of Greece. And then the UK and France, two other democracies, quote unquote, 4.03%. By convention, the IMF head is a European, but the Europeans do not control the IMF. In 1998, the New York Times let slip that the IMF, quote, acts as the United States Treasury's lapdog, unquote. And the United States Treasury, whose lapdog is it? It is Wall Street's lapdog. It is the lapdog of the Peterson forces. Today, it's the lapdog of the Peterson Foundation. Going on with the article. The U.S. has an effective veto on IMF policy. When it suits the American interests, IMF orthodoxy is suspended, as against Mubarak's Egypt in 1987 and 1991. When it suits the U.S. to put the screws on a country, I think the expression is the screws to a country, but okay. That is precisely what the IMF does. Democracy for the people of Ecuador is irrelevant. What is relevant is that they, by hook or by crook, bow before what the IMF and behind them the United States says. Moreno withdrew the cuts on subsidies, but it's likely that in the dark he will return these cuts under another name. Dishonesty, folks. Dishonesty. The agreement he made with the indigenous peoples is dishonest. He intends to abrogate it as soon as he possibly can. The IMF will not stand for anything less than that. The consequences of IMF orthodoxy are often deadly, with the Malawi case as one very painful episode. In 1996, the IMF staff pushed the Malawi government to privatize its agricultural development and marketing corporation. This body held the grain stock of the country, and it regulated the price for the sale of grain in the country. The privatization of the corporation in 1999 left the government without a means to protect its population in case of emergency. Between October 2001 and March 2002, the price of maize shot up by 400%. Flooding in 2000 to 2001 and a year of drought. By the way, of course, are the beginnings of changes wrought by climate change, and a year of drought set the food production in the country into distress. People began to die of starvation, as many as 3,000. The IMF did not relent. It was necessary for Malawi to continue to service its debt. In 2002, it spent $70 million on its debt service payments, which was 20% of its national budget. To put this in perspective, the Weimar government in Germany, when it was hit with the ruinous inflation of the early 20s, that almost caused it to go Nazi then. It didn't go Nazi until, as you know, the 1930s, but it almost went there in 1922, 1923, because of the runaway inflation, in Weimar. Even in the Weimar situation, only 40% of the national budget was devoted to debt service payments. So essentially, Malawi was almost half of the seriousness of the situation, of the Weimar Republic. 20% of its national budget, more than Malawi spent on health, education, and agriculture combined. There was no lifeline through to Malawi, whose food crisis continues till today. The president at that time One Bakili Maluzi said, quote, the IMF is to blame for the biting food crisis, unquote. What happened to Malawi in 2002 is precisely what happened to so many countries that went under the knife of the IMF. No one within the IMF meeting will raise the question of democracy, both in terms of the IMF's own functioning and in terms of the IMF's relationship with sovereign countries around the world. Ecuador's streets rejected the IMF deal. Argentina's electorate will do the same in a few weeks. Will there be room to start a conversation now about the divergence between IMF policy and democracy? And I hope the divergence between the neoliberalism that guides IMF policy and democracy? I don't know. I seriously doubt it. The main lesson of these uprisings is not only that the people want fuel subsidies or a stable currency, what they want more than anything is democratic control over their own economy. All I have to say to that is to get democratic control over your own economy, you first need to get democratic control over your own currency. That is, you have to become a monetarily sovereign country, and that implies that when you borrow from the IMF or from any other international source, that loan will not be in a foreign currency but will have to be in your own currency. Either the loan is in your own currency or you don't but take the loan. In fact, what you do is you create your own currency in order to fulfill your needs. Yes, of course, if you're going to do that, you're going to have the internal productivity that is necessary to sustain that. You won't be able to get goods from abroad if people are not willing to accept your own currency in payment. So you will have to watch out not to run deficits that are dangerous in terms of producing inflation in your own currency. You'll have to show that your currency is stable. But that's the only way to get out of the loop. The only way to get out of the vicious circle is to reject the IMF loans and pursue an internal industrial policy. To see how to do that, go to the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. They have programs that can help developing countries to do that, to create a monetarily sovereign currency and a monetarily sovereign economy controlled by the people, and one that will produce sustainable growth over a period of time. So, there is lesson number one, the dishonesty of the IMF, which of course never tells people that its loans are incompatible with building a democracy, nearly self-defeating in that respect. So let's move here to the second instance that we have this evening, which is Mr. Pence and Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Trump. Pence and Erdogan agree on a ceasefire plan, but the Kurds reject, quote, occupation, unquote. In conflict, surprise, in conflict with the statement from the President of the United States saying, this is a wonderful deal, and the Kurds are very happy with it. very happy with it. It's a great deal for them. It's a great deal for Turkey. It's a great deal for everybody. I negotiated a great deal. This was written by Bethan McKernan in Istanbul and Julian Borger, okay, in Washington. Uh, and it was published in The Guardian, okay, today, I believe, if I have this right. Yes, October 17th, 2019, that is today. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has agreed with the U.S. Vice President Mike Pence to suspend Ankara's operation on Kurdish led forces in northeast Syria for the next 5 days in order to allow Kurdish troops to withdraw, potentially haunting the latest episode of bloodshed in Syria's long war. Syrian democratic forces would pull back from Turkey's proposed 20-mile, 32-kilometer deep safe zone on its border. Pence told reporters in Ankara on Thursday evening after hours of meetings with the Turkish officials. So let's get this straight, folks. In return for not proceeding to kill the Kurdish troops, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF fighters, will be allowed to pull back from the area, the Kurdish area, that they previously used as their base and that they were living in. They will be allowed to move back beyond the 32-kilometer deep safe zone on the border, okay, of Turkey, and they won't be attacked during the retreat that they conduct. However, nothing is said about the people that the Kurdish Democratic forces were defending who lived in that area. Nothing was said about what would happen to them. Would they be able to withdraw? And if they were able to withdraw, where would they find homes? Where would they settle? Where would they go? Quote, it will be a pause for 120 hours while the U.S. oversees the withdrawal of the YPG, a Kurdish unit within the SDF. Once that is completed, Turkey has led to a permanent ceasefire, Pence said, adding that preparations were already underway. So, the U.S. then has agreed that it is going to oversee the withdrawal of the YPG, a Kurdish unit within the SDF. It's going to oversee their withdrawal, which means what? Are the limited number of troops we have there going to force the Kurds to withdraw? What if the Kurds turn on our troops and start shooting our troops? As I understand it, the Kurdish units there greatly outnumber our 1,000 or so troops in the area. And the Kurdish troops there are fairly well armed when it comes to small arms combat and mortars and anti-tank weapons and devices of that sort. So has Pence agreed Has Pence agreed to ordering our U.S. soldiers, our U.S. Special Forces, who were recently closely allied with the Kurds, who were brothers in arms of the Kurds? Is he now going to order our soldiers, our special forces, to fire upon the Kurds, who they most recently fought with? If the YPG refuses to get out of the area? Furthermore, if they refuse to get out of the area, is Pence going to order the United States to drone the Kurdish forces? I wonder. Once that is completed, Turkey has agreed to a permanent ceasefire. Well, why not? Turkey's plan Turkey's plan was to establish the safe zone on its border. That was its original aim. Establish the safe zone. Ethnically cleanse it. Drive all the Kurds out. Or kill them if they insisted on staying. But of course, in Erdogan's original plan, it was going to be the Turkish forces that did that. But now Pence has agreed. He has told Erdogan and Mr. Tough Guy Trump has negotiated through Pence a settlement, with Erdogan, where the Turks would no longer be responsible for driving the Kurds out, but instead we would assume the responsibility for driving the Kurds out. And Trump says, great news out of Turkey. I've agreed with Erdogan that we'll take on the job of driving the Kurds out. No, he never said that. He said, quote, millions of lives will be saved, unquote. Millions of lives will be saved if the Kurds agree to be ethnically cleansed and displaced from their homes. Yes, if they agree to simply surrender, millions of lives will be saved until the next time when the Turks want to take over a part of Syria that is under the control of the Kurds. By the way, what the Kurds plan to do with that area, of Syria, once they cleanse it, they plan to bring in Sunni refugees now living in Turkey to give them the land in that particular area so they can serve as a buffer against the Kurds. What Turkey will probably do is try to put Sunni fundamentalists in that area to fight with the Kurds. What a wonderful solution. Millions of lives will be saved. Yeah, in a pig's eye. The arrangement, however, appeared to be a significant U.S. embrace of Turkey's position in the week-long conflict and did not publicly define the safe zone's borders. So a wonderful negotiator did not even get a limit to the safe zone's borders actually negotiated with Turkey. General Mazloum Kobani of the SDF confirmed the ceasefire deal in comments to local television on Thursday night, but said it only applied to the area between the towns of Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain, both of which have seen heavy fighting. Damascus and Moscow, who have since also moved troops into the contested border zone, also had no immediate comment. Erdogan is due to meet his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Sochi on Tuesday. That's in Russia, where it is expected more concrete talks on the size of Turkey's planned buffer zone will take place. I wonder whether Putin is going to let Erdogan go home. Now, that's an idea. Don't let Erdogan go home until he withdraws the troops. But Putin won't do that. The initial plan was met with skepticism by many Syrian Kurds on Thursday night. And as it gives the Turks what they had sought to achieve with the military operation in the first place: removal of Kurdish-led forces from the border. When asked, Pence remained silent on whether the agreement amounted to a second abandonment of the U.S. former Kurdish allies in the fight against the Islamic State. What a diplomat that Pence is. He remains silent when confronted with an ineluctable fact. A statement released after the meeting reiterated the U.S. understanding of Turkey's need for a safe zone, which will be primarily enforced by the Turkish armed forces after the Kurdish withdrawal, implying that Ankara still intends to occupy the 270-mile, 440-kilometer stretch of land, which includes several important Kurdish towns and parts of a major highway. And by the way, wasn't that cited earlier in the same article as a safe zone that would be 20 miles or 32 kilometers deep? Now, all of a sudden, Ankara intends to occupy the 270-mile, 440-kilometer stretch of land, which includes several important Kurdish towns and parts of a major highway. Wow, that 20-mile deep has extended 270-mile deep stretch of land. It also made no mention of the presence of Syrian government and Russian troops who are invited to the area by the SDF to help defend against the Turkish attack and are not bound by the terms of the U.S.-Turkish agreement. I got news for them. The Kurds aren't bound by that agreement either. They weren't a party to it. What a deal Trump has negotiated. Maybe he'll write a second book on the art of the deal. What do you say? You think he'll do that? Quote, "Our people did not want this war. We welcome the ceasefire, but we will defend ourselves in the event of any attack. Ceasefire is one thing, and surrender is another thing, and we are ready to defend ourselves. We will not accept the occupation of northern Syria," unquote. The Kurdish political leader Saleh Muslim told local television. We've previously stated that Turkey's proposal of entering a depth of 30 kilometers inside Syrian territory is rejected. Aldir Zalil, another senior political figure, was quoted by local media saying after the news of the Ankara agreement broke. The deal was, quote, a day for civilization, Trump said to reporters before praising Erdogan as, quote, okay, a hell of a leader, unquote. Trump seemed to endorse Turkey's aim of ridding the Syrian side of the border of the Kurdish fighters who fought ISIS on behalf of the U.S., but who Ankara regards as proxies for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, that has waged a 35-year insurgency against the Turkish state. Quote, they had to have it cleaned out, he told reporters. But the deal was condemned by Republican Senator Mitt Romney, who said Trump's decision to abandon Kurdish allies in Syria, quote, will stand as a bloodstain in the annals of American history. Looks to me like old Mitt is positioning himself for another run for the presidency. What say you? In Ras Al Ain, uh, he may come at it with new blinders full of women. One of the two border towns under attack by Turkey, warplanes and drones were still flying overhead, and ground fighting between the SDF and Syrian rebels allied to Turkey continued. The U.S. and Turkey have mutually committed to peaceful resolution and future for the safe zone, Pence said. In return, the U.S. will not impose further sanctions on Turkey and remove those that were imposed last week once the permanent ceasefire takes hold. I'll bet you what Erdogan said to Trump is, you have 24 hours to end these sanctions or I'm shutting down your hotel in Ankara. Or maybe it's in Istanbul. I'm not sure where the Trump hotel is. Maybe he has hotels in both places. I didn't really check that out, folks. I got to admit it. And here is this now famous letter that looks like it had been written by a schoolyard bully. It says, Dear Mr. President, let's work out a good deal. You don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people, and I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy. And I will. I got news for him. If you destroy the Turkish economy, you'll also slaughter thousands of people. I've already given you a little sample with respect to Pastor Brunson. I wonder what that means. I don't really know. I've worked hard to solve some of your problems. Don't let the world down. You can make a great deal. General Mazloum is willing to negotiate with you, and he is willing to make concessions that they would never have made in the past. I am confidentially enclosing a copy of his letter to me just received. History will look upon you favorably. Wait, lost this in a minute. Will look upon you favorably if you get this done the right and humane way. It will look upon you forever as the devil if good things don't happen. Don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool. I will call you later. Yes, Prime President Erdogan. Don't be a fool. Don't be a fool. Let me be the fool. The senior U.S. delegation had traveled to Ankara with the stated task of pressuring Turkey to halt its offensive in northeast Syria or face sanctions. Hours after Donald Trump said his country had no stake in defending Kurdish fighters who died by the thousands as the U.S. partners against ISIS. On Wednesday, Trump hailed his decision to withdraw U.S. troops in Syria, paving the way for the Turkish offensive as strategically brilliant, declaring that the Kurds he had abandoned were much safer now and were anyway not angels. Oh, God. I must have lost my. Did I lose my clearly? I must have lost my clearly or forgot to get rid of it. Anyway, his remarks not only undercut the mission to Ankara, but contradicted the official assessment of both the State and Defense Departments that the Turkish offensive was a disaster for regional stability and the fight against ISIS. In two further extraordinary developments, a bizarre letter from Trump to Erdogan emerged in which the U.S. warned his Turkish counterpart, quote, don't be a fool, unquote. I just read that rather bizarre letter. And a White House meeting with Democratic lawmakers descended into mutual accusations of, quote, meltdowns, unquote. The letter was sent on October 9th, 3 days after a phone call in which Erdogan informed Trump of his plans and understood the U.S. president had given the green light, Trump issued a statement announcing the offensive was about to happen and that U.S. troops would be moved out of the way. And guess what? Now they're moved back in the way, this time to oversee the withdrawal, which the Kurds have not agreed to, of Kurdish forces. He also invited he also invited Erdogan to the White House. Trump wrote, "History will look upon you favorably if you get this done the right and humane way. It will look upon you forever as the devil if good things don't happen. Don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool." On the day the letter was received, Erdogan launched his offensive to create a buffer zone between Turkey and the territory held by the FDF. It was very easy for Turkey to create, a buffer zone, but it did not decide, to create the buffer zone inside of Turkey. That it did not do. He What he did was to create the buffer zone inside of Syria. And by the way, folks, what that is, technically, according to international law, that is aggression. That is aggression. It fits the classic definition, of an aggression. It is Hitlerian. I'm telling you, it is. The Turkish president had insisted earlier on Wednesday he would, quote, never declare a ceasefire. And he never did. He's never declared a ceasefire. He's just declared a pause. Dishonesty again, folks. While Erdogan has faced global condemnation for the operation, it is broadly popular at home, and any pathway to de escalation probably needed to avoid embarrassing him domestically. On Wednesday, two-thirds of House Republicans supported a resolution condemning Trump's decision to withdraw troops. Well, are they now going to pass a resolution condemning Trump's decision to use U.S. troops to herd the Kurds out of a portion of Syria that is also part of Kurdistan? Will the Republicans do that now? The vote triggered what the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi described as a, quote, as a meltdown, unquote, by the president when she and other members of Congress visited him in the White House. When they walked out of the contentious White House meeting after it devolved into a series of insults, and it became clear the president had no plan to deal with the potential revival of ISIS in the Middle East. No, the president only has plans to create chaos. He never has any plans to end the chaos. All I have to say is Trump must be the worst chess player in the world. He must never contemplate at all the possible consequences of his acts. So, especially when it comes to foreign policy, he's an unmitigated freaking disaster. And then we turn to Mr. Buttigieg's, to Mayor Buttigieg's disingenuous attack on Medicare for all. Yes, on Medicare for All. This is an article written for The Week by Ryan Cooper, a very good columnist for The Week, in my view. It was written on October 15th. Before, by the way, I think it was before the release of the new Urban Institute report that has something to say on Medicare for All, though not on Bernie's Medicare for All bill. Okay, let me rev this up a little bit so you can see it better. Okay, so I can see it better too, since sometimes I think I'm blind as a bat even when I have glasses on. Anyway, his disingenuous attack on Medicare for All. That is Mr. Buttigieg's, Mayor Buttigieg's. In the Democratic presidential debate Tuesday night, once again, Medicare for All was a major focus of discussion. Once again, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren defended the plan against all comers. Most especially Pete Buttigieg, who had a number of slick items about how about how the universal Medicare would be a disaster. There's just one problem. None of Mayor Pete's arguments are true. What Buttigieg did was to level two main attacks. First, along with the moderators, he pressed Warren to admit that she would raise taxes on the middle class to pay for her Medicare for All plan. After the New York Times' Mark Lacey asked her if she should, quote, acknowledge, unquote, she would raise taxes, she partly dodged the question, saying, quote, so the way I see this, it is about what kinds of costs will be faced by middle-class families. So let me be clear on this. Costs will go up for the wealthy. They will go up for big corporations. And for middle-class families, they will go down, unquote. And Buttigieg pounced. Well, we heard it tonight. A yes or no question that didn't get a yes or no answer. Look, this is why people here in the Midwest are so frustrated with Washington in general, Capitol Hill in particular, unquote. Did Mr. Buttigieg ever think that maybe that wasn't a yes or no question? I mean, maybe that was a maybe question. Maybe it was a maybe question. Okay, because maybe Warren would raise taxes on the rich, but not on anybody else. Or maybe Warren would fund the increase in spending due to Medicare for All, which, by the way, at a maximum, is only going to be $1 trillion a year. At a maximum. But I don't think it's going to be $1 trillion a year either. I think it's quite likely that there won't be any increase in taxes to pay for Medicare for All. We might be able to actually save, by going to Medicare for All, 1/3 of our total national health expenditures that we have currently. And it turns out that governments, state, local, and federal, are already laying out 2/3 of the cost of current healthcare expenditures. So if we could save 1/3 of those, then our taxes, which don't actually pay for anything, could be equivalent to the money that the federal government has to create to pay for Medicare for All. Okay, but anyway, Buttigieg pounced. Well, we heard a yes or no question that didn't get a yes or no answer, but I guess I haven't finished, okay, with my objection. So, what she might do is simply administer the Medicare for All program sufficiently efficiently so that no higher taxes have to be levied. She might also decide that even if she doesn't do that, and she only saves one half or two-thirds of what she could, that extra third of potential savings, which would amount to no more than, let's say, 500 billion a year, might just be left, okay, as deficit spending. After all, as a technical matter, she doesn't have to issue bonds to match that level, okay, of deficit spending. All she has to do is get Congress to order the Federal Reserve to place the necessary funds for deficit spending into the Treasury spending account when the appropriation for Medicare for All is passed. That's it. So, it's not a yes or no question. There are alternative ways to do this thing, folks. And maybe she hasn't really decided yet what would be the most politically feasible way to do this thing. After all, what the most feasible way politically is going to depend upon is the level of the majority that she can get in both houses of Congress. And she doesn't really know that yet. I wish she'd simply say that. I wish she'd simply say, look, there are many alternative ways to fund this. Okay, there's no question it can be funded, but how I choose to fund it will depend on the majorities I get in the House and in the Senate. If I get enough of a majority in the House, okay, or in the Senate, then I probably won't raise taxes to do this at all. That's what you should say to people. But if you want me not to raise taxes at all, give me enough of a majority in the House and the Senate, so I can do that. Anyway, that's a completely different opinion and goes beyond what Ryan Cooper was saying here. So he says it's very obvious why Warren refuses to say this outright and is arguably more accurate for her to do so. In the hegemonic neoliberal framework of our political rhetoric, taxes are always a net cost by definition, something that is taken from the American citizenry and spent on government boondoggles or welfare for poor people. Warren doesn't want to hand Donald Trump any attack lines about how she will raise taxes by focusing on what matters, namely net costs for average people. And as HuffPost's Arthur Delaney notes, the Medicare for All critics are leveraging this framework. The tax question is a trap premised on the idea that raising taxes is always bad politics. The moderator already knows the candidate's position. Both the moderator and the candidate, the moderator and the candidate actually believe that answering with a simple yes would launch 1,000 Republican attack ads. Not answering doesn't work either. After the September debate, TV analysts and the Republicans' National Committee bashed Warren for not disavowing taxes and not embracing them. Sure, they bashed her for not saying what they wanted to say so they can run all these attack ads, right? Great. But I don't really agree with the political analysis here. Yes, things might work, okay, in that way. But what if Warren said, with Bernie, No, I'm not going to raise taxes on the middle class. I'm not going to raise taxes on poor people. I'm only going to raise taxes on wealthy people according to my wealth tax plan. And not only do I agree with Bernie when it comes to Medicare for all, in terms of the benefits for Medicare for all, and in terms of no premiums, no copays, and no deductibles in relation to Medicare for all, but I also agree with Bernie on his program for taxing wealth in the United States. And after seeing his program, I agree that it's perhaps a better program even than I have. And so I'm now aligning myself with Bernie completely. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to impose his tax program on the wealthy, which will surely completely cover this. Well, how do you like that? And by the way, Republicans, the polls are overwhelmingly in favor of taxing your wealthy cronies. So let's see you run your attack ads now. What about the politics of that, Huffington Post? What's wrong with that? What really matters here is that while Medicare for All would require some additional taxes on the middle class, no, don't give that. Don't give in on that. Gabriel Zuckman. Those increases would be more than compensated for by zeroing out premium copays and deductibles. Okay, as economist Gabriel Zuckman says. Now, one could take a different view on the best way to respond to this type of question. Oh, here it is. Bernie Sanders forthrightly admits that Medicare for All would require some additional taxation on the average citizen. Yeah, I don't think Bernie should be admitting that either, by the way. I think that my strategy for handling this, okay, is better. In other words, promise to just tax the frickin' hell out of the wealthy people as much as the traffic will bear. And if they respond by saying that doesn't pay for Medicare for All bill, say BS. It's absolutely true that we're going to save money under Medicare for All. We're already spending $2.5 trillion from all levels, okay, of government. If we collect 600 billion more from the wealthy corporations and the wealthy individuals, which amount of money is certainly there from taxing wealth, then we certainly will be able to pay for any difference, just in case 2.5 trillion is not enough to pay for everything, and we need 3.1 trillion. We can easily take that out of their hides. How does that poll, folks? Quote, under the Medicare for All bill that I wrote, premiums are gone, co-payments are gone, deductibles are gone, all out-of-pocket expenses are gone. The overwhelming majority of people will save money on their health care bills, but I do think it is appropriate to acknowledge that taxes will go up, unquote. Bernie, you give up too easy. You give up too easy. You give up these arguments to them too easy. You have good studies of how much Medicare for All is going to cost from Steffi Woolhandler and David Himmelstein. And you have good studies about how much we're spending on healthcare right now from those two as well. Use what they have and argue that you're not going to raise taxes on the middle class. Be more aggressive, damn it. Second, Mayor Buttigieg claimed that Medicare for All would cost trillions. Well, of course it's going to cost trillions. It costs trillions now. Quote, no plan has been laid out to explain how a multi-trillion-dollar hole in this Medicare for All plan that Senator Warren is putting forward is supposed to get filled in, unquote. On the specifics, Buttigieg is wrong. Actually, the Sanders bill, which Warren supports, has a lot of funding mechanisms outlined. A lot of funding mechanisms suggested Bernie has not decided on the funding mechanisms himself, though here he seems to decide that there will be more taxes. But in the actual bill, or the appendage to the bill, where some of the possible sources are discussed, he hasn't committed to anything, really. But on a deeper level, but Buttigieg's argument is even more deceptive. He was likely referencing the study from the Libertarian Mercatus Center about how much additional tax revenue would be needed to finance Medicare for all, just over 30 trillion, as Joe Biden said later. Actually, the Mercatus Center said 32 trillion. What that figure leaves out is that total healthcare spending under universal Medicare would go down by some 2 trillion over a decade. And what it further leaves out is that the Mercatus Center is a hack propaganda shop whose work is heavily biased against progressive policy. Ryan had it on the money right there. As I have previously explained in detail, what Medicare for All would cost depends entirely on how much policymakers want to crack down on waste and fraud and squeeze down the prices of the providers. Indeed, we could have a universal Medicare without a dime in additional taxes if we crushed prices down to Canadian levels. Absolutely true. We could then get to the level of spending 11% of our GDP on Medicare for all. And if we got to that 11%, well, this year we're spending 3.8 trillion and we're at 18%. So figure out what 7% of 3.8 trillion dollars is. It's 380 billion per percent. So we're looking at $2.5 trillion, which is what we spend in taxes at all levels of government right now. In fact, we might be spending more right now. My $2.5 trillion figure is based on a study by Himmelstein, and Woolhandler that was done, as I recall, in 2016 or 2017 in terms of what our governments at all levels were spending on healthcare back then. Now they're spending more. I guarantee it. Maybe they're spending 2.6 million or 2.6 trillion or 2.7 trillion. Don't worry. It's going to be enough if we crush prices down to Canadian levels. Let's do that. I'm for that. Why isn't Bernie for that? These savings, says Cooper, would come from eliminating duplicative administration and the price-setting power over providers that the Medicare for All program would provide. Those savings would necessarily be less in more fragmented systems, which would preserve private insurance, like the system proposed by Mayor Buttigieg. In other words, Mayor Pete's plan would be more expensive than Medicare for All. He would, quote, pay for that, unquote, by keeping more of the cost burden on the shoulders of individual Americans. I, for one, have had quite enough of Mayor Buttigieg's glib, turbo-wonk shtick. He simply is not being straight with the American people. Again, on the money. Ryan Cooper is on the money in this article. And the implication is Bernie needs to be more aggressive and more straightforward than he has been thus far. So, I want to end my going through articles tonight with something from Katie Johnstone, which I thought was kind of a gem. and I'll proceed as soon as my system decides to cooperate. And the title of the article is Truth is a Kremlin Talking Point. It's by Caitlin Johnstone, and she published it on Medium on October 16th. And she starts off with some tweets. Okay. And so Molly McHugh says, I now retract any vaguely nice thing I ever said about Yang knowing technology things because he answered the question on Putin with moral equivalency and a Kremlin talking point. Amy K, A+ swing on that. And she was replied to by Lee McElroth. Literally a Kremlin talking point, but whatever. And there's this quote from Now This. Okay, Now This News. Tulsi Gabbard on troops in Syria. Quote, Donald Trump has the blood of the Kurds on his hands, but so do many of the politicians in our countries from both parties. Unquote, hashtag Dem debates. And so Leah McElrath is saying that literally that's a Kremlin talking point. Okay, but whatever. What is she smoking? That's absolutely true. And Katie says, in response to a statement during the Democratic primary debates by presidential candidate Andrew Yang, let me blow this up a bit. That both Russia and the United States have engaged in election interference. Liberal pundit Molly McHugh tweeted, quote, I now retract any vaguely nice thing I ever said about Yang knowing technology things because he answered the question on Putin with moral equivalency and a Kremlin talking point. If you're in the mood for some depressing amusement, just type the words, quote, Kremlin talking point, without quotation marks into Twitter's search engine, and scroll through all the results which come up. Just keep on scrolling and observe how this label, Kremlin talking point, gets bleated by mainstream empire loyalists to dismiss subjects ranging from the rigging of Democratic primaries to criticism of U.S. regime change wars to endless U.S. warmongering to concerns about new Cold War escalations to disliking John McCain to criticism of Nancy Pelosi. Any criticism of the status quo, which cannot be labeled false or misleading, gets labeled a talking point, quote unquote, of Russia, Putin, the Kremlin, by those who support and defend the status quo of U.S. centralized imperialist world hegemony. Yang's statement about U.S. intervention in foreign elections is indisputably true, of course. Both alternative and mainstream outlets in the media have thoroughly documented the fact that the U.S. government's own data shows them to have interfered in scores of foreign elections. For those who don't know, a score is 20. 20. So there are scores of foreign elections. How much? 5 score? 10 score? 20 score? Far more than any other nation on earth, says Katie. This includes an interference in Russian elections in the 90s That was so brazen they made a Hollywood movie about it. Former CIA director Woolsey openly admitted on Fox News last year the U.S. still interferes in foreign elections to this very day. These are not conspiracies. These are not even secrets. These are facts. But because they're inconvenient facts, they get labeled, quote, Kremlin talking points by those whose job it is to defend the status quo. Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard was also branded with the accusation of voicing, quote, Kremlin talking points, unquote, for remarks she made during last night's debate. In her case, those, quote, talking points, unquote, consisted of the indisputable fact that the bloodshed in Syria, not all the bloodshed in Syria, but certainly a great deal of it, can be blamed on U.S. politicians from both parties, and the indisputable fact that the U.S. has armed by extremist militias in that nation with the goal of effecting regime change. The second of the indisputable facts is there is, I should say, the second and third, okay, of the indisputable facts there is indisputably true. Quote, literally a Kremlin talking point, but whatever, tweeted hashtag resistance pundit Leah McElrath in response to Gabbard's debate comments. Quote, it is a fact that Russian talking points for years has been that U.S. arms Al-Qaeda in Syria. Tulsi Gabbard just said it on television, unquote, tweeted journalist Scott Stedman. Yeah, but it may have been a Russian talking point for years, but that doesn't make it not true. It was true. It was true that we armed the remnants of Al Qaeda in Syria. It's been carried in all the major news outlets, even in the mainstream news outlets. Quote, how odd to listen to Tulsi Gabbard mouthing Syria and Russian talking points on the Democratic debate stage. Sorry, but no one thinks that U.S. troops withdrawn by Trump were there as part of a, quote, regime change war by the U.S. Oh my God. Unquote. Tweeted Susan Glasser of CNN, okay, and the New Yorker. So the establishment had narrative, the managers, okay, of that particular narrative now have an official three-word debunk of any criticism of the establishment which employs them, which applies even when that criticism is fully based in facts and reality. Facts are a Kremlin talking point. Anyone who believes them is Russian. Facts are Russian. Truth is Russian. Skepticism is Russian. Asking questions is Russian. Dissent is Russian. Revolution is Russian. So let's all get Russian then, baby. Let's all fill our heads with objectively true Kremlin talking points and Cossack dance our way to a fact-based relationship with a reality. Get as Russian as possible. Get aggressively Russian. Get offensively Russian. Get so Russian it hurts. Get so Russian it it curls Louise Mensch's hair. If they're going to start telling us the truth is Russian, then the only appropriate thing to say in response is Das Vidanya, which, by the way, is goodbye in Russian. Yeah, it's one of the things I learned so many years ago. I took some Russian, never quite learned how to speak it. Okay. I took it for a year in undergraduate school. I learned it sufficiently well that at the time I could read it, but I never did get to fluency when it came to speaking the damn thing. But in many ways, it's a very lovely language. In Russia, they roll the R's. They have a way of rolling the R's. One of the only languages that is actually prettier than Russian in pronunciation is probably French, which was the other language that I took. Anyway, enough of languages and enough of going through these articles to make the talking point that we are swimming in total dishonesty and total propaganda all through the world and all through the political system, all through the political system of the United States. And the lesson to really be learned about this is that it is one of the requirements for a healthy democracy to have a certain amount, okay, of honesty, a certain amount of truth, so democracy can cope with the reality surrounding it. When we get overwhelmed with dishonesty, okay, and lies, our perceptions of the real world are colored to such a degree that we cannot possibly adapt in order to solve our problems, in order to survive. We cannot even see our problems clearly so that we can cope with them. That is the problem with America today, and the problem with much of the world as well. We have to begin to insist on honesty, as much honesty as possible in our politics. And we need to begin with Trump. Nearly the worst of his high crimes, okay, and misdemeanors, is that he lies so regularly and so often and with so few qualms. And that is one of the reasons why we need and have always needed to get him out of the White House immediately, if not sooner. So let me shift my view now and go back to Facebook to see what your views have been. Before I do that, let me show my please share, like, and subscribe screen and remind you that my Patreon account is at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And now I will cease to flash my commercial and go back to my Facebook page, where I hope you all still are. At least some of you are still here, and that is a good sign. Thank you. So, that is a good sign. And so, here is Russell. And Teresa says, "Hi, Russell." And Russ says, "Hey back, Teresa Sanders." Matt Waldy has joined. Cheyenne says, "In loving memory of Representative Elijah Cummings." Yes, Elijah Cummings was a great man, and he will be missed on the oversight committee. I hope his likely successor, which is probably by Carolyn Maloney, will do as well in being able to manage relations between the progressives on this very key committee and the more centrist Democrats, and especially the blue dogs on the committee. We'll have to see what happens. As for what I suspect will happen to Elijah Cummings' own seat, I fully expect that his wife, who is the state chairman of the Democratic Party of Maryland, at this point, is very likely to succeed him in the Congress. She is a fairly young woman, at least compared to Elijah Cummings, and is likely to carry on in their tradition for quite a few years to come. But we have to see how that situation is going to develop over time. There will be a special elections called in Maryland, because that's the law in Maryland. There will be a primary. She will have to run in a primary. Whether she'll be contested or not, I don't know. Then there's going to be, I think, an election. I think if she runs, she's pretty sure to win the primary, and she's pretty sure to win at the election as well. A comment, from Evelina, who says, of course, Bernie is being too nice, and Cora Manuel has joined, and he says hi, and Sandy Degg says hello, and Margot Shepard has joined. But also Dominique Morgan has joined. Hi, Dominique. And Steve Wilbrandt. Hi, Steve. Hi, Dolores. Hi again, Sandy. Evelina points out October 27th elections in Argentina, when hopefully the progressives in Argentina will be taking over again and throwing out the IMF again, I hope. Karen says, howdy, been a while. Yes, it's been a while, Karen. I certainly missed you. Ernest Jones says, joined. He didn't say joined, he did join. And Barbara Wernick has joined. And hi to you both. And Cora says, my wife is playing Trump's live speech. He just bragged about arranging a ceasefire in Syria. Yeah. He just bragged about his second sellout of the Kurds. Cheyenne has a lot of hearts and diamonds and various icons. And Jeffrey Ginter has joined. Hiya, Jeff. And Cora Manuel said, he also said that sometimes you gotta let them fight it out to show everybody how tough it is to be in there. A pretty heartless thing to say. Well, it's not a question of equals fighting it out. It's a question of a pretty powerful nation with a military fully trained by the United States, with a lot of heavy equipment, trying to snuff out a group of people who, comparatively speaking, have much less capability in terms of arms and technology. In fact, the news has surfaced. I wasn't going to cover it actually tonight. But the news has surfaced that for years Turkey has been using drone technology sold to them by the US to kill the Kurds, actually, presumably the Turkish Kurds, but were the Kurds inside, okay, of Turkey, but also, in addition, to at times drone the Syrian defense forces as well, because Turkey has attacked across the border before, not in a comprehensive way, but it has attacked across the border before, and it has used drones to do that, is my understanding, and those were U.S. drones. I don't think the Syrian Kurds actually have known about this. But this article has surfaced now, and they're now going to hear about it and what their reaction, okay, is going to be. Trump's a puppet for military-industrial complex loyalists. And she says Buddha butt. Buddha butt. Karen Reese says true, or anyone with money. Cheyenne says most elitists are war profiteers. And Cheyenne says Nico House did a great show on the Tulsi Buddha butt exchange. I saw some of that. I wasn't able to watch the whole thing because I had to shift to some other things today. But I watch Nico a lot. I like his style and his honesty, and usually his analysis. Okay, I don't always agree, but we have a lot in common. Cheyenne says, okay, that Medicare for All needs a lot more coverage than any of the plans include. People are literally dying to lack of specific treatments. One size does not fit all. Yes. Now, Medicare for All needs a lot more coverage. The kind of coverage it needs is coverage about what's in the bill, the details of the bills. We should be debating. What we should be debating now is whether the House bill should be passed or the Senate bill should be passed, or whether there's even a better Medicare for All bill that should be passed that might be offered by some kind of alternative source. But the debate about whether we should be having a Medicare for All bill with no copays and no deductibles, okay, and no premiums or not, that should be over. It is obvious that we need one structured in that way for all people to be able to take advantage of. And not just those three things, but also long term nursing home care in that bill, also dental coverage, also vision coverage, also full hearing coverage. All those things. Most probably chiropractic as well. It's all going to be covered, but people do not know it. I think Bernie's campaign has been really derelict in not devoting resources to campaigning among seniors. Seniors do not know how much money they're likely to save from the various programs that Bernie has going. I've been through the programs. My own family is likely to save up to $18,000 a year from Bernie's various programs. I mean, they are pure gold to us. I am getting close to 81 now, and Barney is close behind me. That's what it would mean for people of our age. Now, right now, most of those people are probably going to vote for the white Republican, not knowing the gains that they would get from Bernie's agenda. When is he going to devote some resources to campaigning among seniors? It's ridiculous. He would have won the primaries in 2016 if he had campaigned among seniors with the same agenda he has now. Russ has to call it a night. Okay, Russ, have a good night. But Evelina says, I share your indignation on most things. Steve says, Bernie advisors are not good. Actually, I think in many ways, they're very, very good. I think they're very, very good on the millennials, and they're very, very good in many ways on how to campaign. But as with any campaign, it can always be improved. It's also true that some of the professional advisors on campaigns, when it comes to the ins and outs on campaigns, are not the best advisors when it comes to connecting up the agendas and the policies to various parts of the population, because perhaps they're not really that familiar with the details of the agendas. They're more familiar with the mechanics of how you get people organized, or how you reach them, or how you formulate the language and the framing, okay, of what you're going to do. But maybe they're not so strong on the details of the agenda sitting on Bernie's website. Anyway, continuing on. Steve says, I know and I love Bernie, but he's not getting good advice. Cheyenne Tierra says, bingo, Tulsi. Evelina says, all the gods know. Steve, and Cheyenne says to Steve Wolfbrandt that she agrees 100%. And Teresa says, oh, that's alarming. And Teresa says, yikes. Cheyenne says, signing off, allies, peace. Okay, Evelina responds with pause, which I think probably means peace in Spanish. Let me find some other comments. Jim Bird has joined. Okay, and Evelina says, we roll the R in Spanish. Laugh out loud. Yes. Okay. Iowa Public Television was, Spanish is a beautiful language too. So is Italian. The Romance languages in general are beautiful. And Jim Bird says Iowa Public Television was pushing the Russia affected the election bull crap. Yeah, now, I don't think anybody can prove that Russia had absolutely no effect on the election. But on the other hand, I noticed the intelligence agencies are not so anxious to come out with the evidence as to what the likely proportionate effect of the Russian interference in the election was, or the attempted interference by the Russian was. Okay, by Russia was. For example, was it as important in swinging the election as the absolutely stupid campaign that Clinton ran? Was it as important in losing the election as the interference of Comey in with 1 week to go, okay, in the election? Was it as important in swinging the election as the rigging of the nomination was in the first place, replacing Bernie with the tremendously unpopular Hillary Clinton? I'll wager that the three factors that I mentioned were overwhelmingly more important in swinging the election to Donald Trump. Because without them, I think the Democrats would have won that election by 60% to 40%. Instead of it being a very close vote with the Electoral College going to Trump. Ridiculous. Jim Bird. Endowments are not always good for non-biased or neutral news or opinions. Yes. Jim says, M4A is more about the proper preventative maintenance of our bodies. It's about that, Jim, but it's also about the reduction in costs. It's about the reduction in the percentage of our GDP that is taken by healthcare compared to other things. It is also about the sheer security of being able to go to the doctor when you need to. It's also about early catching of serious diseases when they begin to occur. Sandy Degg says, again, Bernie needs Joe as an advisor. Well, I'm not here campaigning to be an advisor to Bernie. Evelina says, please give Bernie a call. It would be more effective if others gave him a call, okay, than if I gave him a call. But in any case, I'm sure there are other very good advisors who think in a similar way to myself. I'm not holding a brief for myself or trying to get a job with Bernie, though I would do anything I can to help him out. Teresa says it would be great to get some clips from this on various topics individually, Dr. Joe. Teresa says, cutting out. Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, it would be great, okay, to get some clips. I wish I had some time to get some clips. What I need to have is some video editors to help and to start to make short videos from the long streams that I do. I have them up, okay, on YouTube, so I don't think it would be that hard, okay, to do that. I also don't think that every word I say is a total gem. I'm not able to program things, okay, in the way that, let's say, they can do on the Rising program, okay, on the Hill, where it seems like the whole program is carefully planned, okay, and scripted. I don't have the kind of time that that kind of thing is going to actually require. But I wish I did. Anyway, it's just about time for me to call it a night. I will stay around for any more questions or comments for just a little longer. But, maybe let's have a few to close the program. But, oh, by the way, I never really say this, but this is the in-depth program on behalf of New Macro Media, with Joe Firestone. Sometimes the In Depth program comes on behalf of the Center for the Public Purpose. There are two different companies involved. New Macro Media is an LLC. The Center for the Public Purpose is an Oregon nonprofit, not yet a federal 501c3, but intending to become one. So these companies are two separate companies, but currently I am the live streamer for both of them, the primary live streamer for both of them. And I do macro media when I'm being extremely political, when I'm talking more abstractly about the public purpose, okay, or MMT issues. I usually come on behalf of the Center for the Public Purpose. So, good night, Teresa. Thank you for coming and for contributing. And thank you all for coming and for contributing. And good night to everybody. I'll be back again on Saturday night. I will be off tomorrow. Dale Weaver has joined. And Dolores says, thank you. Okay, good night. I'm sorry to just be leaving, Dale. But I've been on since maybe 9:10 or so. So it is time to go. And give everybody a chance to wind down before going to sleep. Okay, bye, Evelina. Have a very nice night.